Welcome everyone. Today we are diving into chapter 3, which focuses on the power and responsibilities of the government. We will explore how public health is organized and paid for in the United States, examining the role of the local, state, and federal levels. We will also look at the legal authority that allows these structures to protect our communities as well as funding mechanisms that keep these programs running. Let's begin by looking at some key vocabulary. Let's review the key terms that will form the foundation of our discussion today. Here are the first few key terms you need to know. We will be frequently mentioning major federal agencies such as the CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. We also discuss the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and the National Institute of Health, NIH. And finally, we will outline the distinct role of the local public health agencies and the state health departments. Continuing with our key terms, we will examine the overall federal role in public health. You will also learn about the morbidity and mortality weekly reports, or MMWR, a critical publication. We will discuss the impact of non governmental organizations or NGOs, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and the unique position of the Surgeon General. Now that we know the terminology, let's look at the next slide to understand who is ultimately responsible for our health. Government's ultimate responsibility. Governments ultimately have the responsibility of making the organized community efforts necessary to protect the health of the population. However, many other organizations and community groups are also important participants. It is important to understand the government's role is determined by law. This means that the government's public health activities must be authorized by legislation at the federal, state, or local levels. So, how is this legal authority structured? The structure of public health law. Public health law is further defined by decisions of the court at the various levels. The broad decisions of the legislative and judicial branch of the government are worked out in detail by executive branch. This is usually handled by the agencies that issue regulation and carry out public health programs. The ultimate, the ultimate authority that allows the laws to be written is a constitution or a charter, whether federal, state, or local. Thus, the body of Public health law is massive, consisting of all the written statements relating to the health by any of the three branches of governments at the federal, state, and local levels. But the government doesn't work alone. Many non governmental organizations or NGOs play an important role in public health, especially through educational programs and lobbying. In recent years, stimulated in part by the Institute of Medicine's report titled The Future of Public Health, there has been an increasing emphasis on community involvement in public health planning. We are seeing a push of generating support for an participation in public health activities. This process expands the concept of the public health system to include, for example, hospitals, businesses, and religious organizations. Next, I will see you how authority is divided between the federal and state government. Interestingly, the United States Constitution doesn't actually mention health because the 10th Amendment states that the power not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the state respectively. Public health has been responsibility primarily of the states. Let's explore what the state responsibility looks like. Most state constitution provide the protection for the protection of public health. In fact, the original states already had law concerning health before the constitution took effect. All states have laws such as mandates to collect data about the population, to immunize children before they enter school, to regulate the environment for the purpose of sanitation, and to regulate safety. To a varying extent, responsibility for some public health activities may be delegated by the state to local government. If states have the primary power, how does the federal government get involved? I will explain this. Federal authority, interstate commerce. The United States Constitution uh, include among the fundamental purposes of government to promote general welfare. It gives the federal governmental authority to regulate interstate commerce. These powers are the basis for federal rule in public health. The interstate commerce provision, for example, justifies the activities of the Food and Drug Administration or FDA, which oversees extensive federal regulation of foods, drugs, medical devices, and cosmetics, most of which are distributed across state lines. It is obviously more efficient and economical for the industries that produce these products to be bound by uniform national rules rather than having to comply with 50 different sets of state regulation. The federal government has another powerful tool which I will discuss now: power to tax and spend. The Constitution allows the federal government to collect taxes, to pay the debts, and to provide for the common defenses and the general welfare. The power to tax and spend enables the federal government to achieve goals that it may lack the authority to address directly. Specifically, the federal government can provide fund to the states subject to certain requirements. Let's look at a classic example of this tax and spend power in action. A great example occurred in 1967 when the federal government mandated that, as a precondition for receiving highway construction funds, states must pass laws requiring motorcyclists to wear helmets. The effectiveness of the mandate was demonstrated by 1975. 47 states had passed such laws, with the result that motorcyclist deaths declined by 30% in these states. However, in 1976, Congress removed the financial uh, penalty for lack of motorcycle helmet laws. By 1980, 27 states had repealed their helmet laws, and motorcycle deaths rose in those states by 38%. Next slide provides another massive example of federal financial influence. Another example of federal influence over state health programs in the Medicaid program for providing health care for the poor. The health or the federal government provides 65% of the funding of Medicaid funding. State States and counties administer the Medicaid program, providing the remaining funds. However, they must follow the guidelines established by Congress to receive the funds. The balance of power between state and federal governments shifts over time. Since World War II, the federal government has used these powers to steadily widen its role in public health. The trend began to reverse in the 1980s in a political climate hostile to government, especially the federal government, there was a strong movement in the United States. Congress and the United States Supreme Court to cut government regulation and return more power to the states. For instance, the Medicaid program, which has become enormously expensive since it was established in 1965, has also been a target of Congress, which for some time threatened, without success, to hand it over to the state entirely. This push for state power continued into 1990s. The new federalism trend, 1990s. In the 1990s, the United States Supreme Court under Chief Justice William began a trend known as New Federalism, which limited Congress's power and returned authority to the states. For example, in 1995, the court struck down a law making gun possession within a school zone a federal offense, rejecting the argument that gun possession was a matter of interstate commerce. In 2001, the court or it decided that the Americans with Disabilities Act could not be enforced against the state, ruling that a woman who was fired from her state job because she had breast cancer could not sue the state of Alabama. However, a global event shifted this perspective again. New federalism lost much of its momentum after 11th of September, as one reporter noted. Suddenly the federal government looked useful, even necessary. In 2003, the ranks ruled that state government could be used for violating the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act. The Supreme Court has since affirmed the priority of federal law over state law in decisions involving medical marijuana in California in 2005, gun control in Washington, D.C. in 2008, and same sex marriage in 2015. Now let's switch gear and talk about how the government enforces law on on an individual levels. In the next slide, I will cover the police power. Governments have a broad power to act in ways that curtail the rights of individuals. These police powers of government are basic to public health and are reason why public health must ultimately be government's responsibility. Police powers are invoked of three distinct reasons. One, Reason one, to prevent a person from harming others. Number two, to defend the interest in competent persons such as children or the mentally disabled. And number three, in some cases, to protect a person from harming himself or herself. Let's look at the historic legal case regarding these powers. Laws have been used to enforce compliance in health matters for more than a century. In 1905, Massachusetts passed a law requiring all adults to be vaccinated against smallpoxes. A man named Jacobson Jacobson refused to comply and went to court, arguing that the law infringed on his personal liberty. Jacobson appealed his case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, but he lost. The Supreme Court upheld the right of the state to restrict an individual freedom for the common good. So, how do these laws actually get made and tested? This is I will discuss in the next part of the same chapter in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention and goodbye.